Forum and securing the presence of the congressman. She's been in charge of this housing initiative, and she's done a great job. So I just want to say thank you to her. Let me begin also by thanking Liberty Bay Credit Union, and in particular the CEO, who is here today, John Barron, for sponsoring this morning's breakfast. And before I turn it over to John to lead the discussion, I just want to quickly remind you of a couple other events the New England Council will be having. It has been extremely busy. Yesterday we were in New Hampshire for Senator Maggie Hassan. Friday of this past week we were in New Hampshire for Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana spoke to the New England Council. Next week, Monday, we'll be back to New Hampshire to Politics and Eggs. We'll have Jonathan Martin from Politico. For all you political junkies that want to know what is going on in different races throughout the country, he'll be speaking to the New England Council. Then we'll leave there. We go back to Rhode Island. Governor McKee will be speaking to the New England Council. And then at the end of the month of June, we have the Deputy Secretary of Energy who will be speaking to the New England Council on an issue as prevalent as housing is, and that's energy and the outlook for energy here in New England. So pretty busy schedule, to say the least, and we haven't taken a foot off the gas. We have more events coming up very, very shortly. But needless to say, today we're honored to have my congressman, someone that I have known since he was first elected to the state legislature and went on to become the state senator and then became the United States representative for his district. And he's going to be introduced with a formal introduction by John Barron. But I'll just say quickly, this man has never, ever forgotten where he came from. I've seen too many people go to Washington where Washington changed them. Not in this case. And I've often said, some people go to Washington and make a name. Others go to Washington and make a difference. That's what this man does. Makes a difference, but very close to his district. He really, when he analyzes a vote, he always thinks, is this something I can explain to the people in Norwood, Braintree, Weymouth, South Boston, Dorchester? But John is going to give a more formal introduction. John assumed his current position in February 2025 after previously serving as the Chief Strategy and Growth Officer for the multi-bank holding company of South Shore Bank and Dedham Savings. Early in the career, John held positions Rockland Trust as well as MIT Lincoln Laboratories. Many of you know that the credit union is located in Braintree, Liberty Bay, and it's one of the largest credit unions in Massachusetts, over $800 million in assets and more than 23,000 members. He's been an active member of the New England Council Housing Working Group. Needless to say, we're grateful to him for his support of today's program, but also for his support of the New England Council, and also his willingness to serve as a moderator for today's discussion. So with that, I thank you all for joining us this morning for this very timely discussion. As I said, we were in New Hampshire yesterday, and we were told yesterday that the median price of a home in New Hampshire, $600,000. We heard yesterday also that the median price here in Greater Boston, $1 million. So obviously this is an important issue to New England and I'd say the country with that. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, everybody. On behalf of Liberty Bay, we're incredibly proud to sponsor today's event in partnership with the New England Council. I would like to extend thank you to the Council's Housing Working Group leadership, the co-chairs David Gasson of the Housing Advisory Group and Amy Asepi of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston. And I'd like to thank Natasha Silva from the New England Council for all the work and help coordinating and preparing for this event. So thank you. Today we're here to talk about the intersection of housing accessibility and its impact on workforce retention in and across New England. The Congressman and I are going to sit down, have a discussion across a range of topics. We will have time at the end, hopefully, for a couple of questions, so please hold those to the end. It is now my distinct privilege to introduce our guest of honor. When we look at public servants who understand the intersection of labor, macroeconomic policy, and the realities of working class families, Congressman Stephen Lynch is certainly at the top of that list. He was born and raised in South Boston, spent his early years growing up in the Old Colony public housing development. He went on to spend 18 years as a structural iron worker, eventually being elected as the youngest president for the Ironworkers Local 7. He later earned his law degree from Boston College, go Eagles, as a fellow Eagles graduate, and a master's from the Harvard Kennedy School before being elected to Congress in 2001. For everyone in the room, in case you didn't know, he serves as a senior member of the powerful House Financial Services Committee, placing him at the center of the national debate on banking, mortgage access, and housing infrastructure. Notably, the 8th Congressional District that he represents stretches from parts of Boston through the suburban commuter belts of Norfolk County, down into Brockton and the South Shore. As we think about today's discussion, that district is a microcosm of the state in the New England region, and the impact and the issues we think of. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm New England Council welcome to Congressman Stephen Lynch.
Regularly, yeah. Yeah, he's got pictures, he says. Yeah, thanks. But it's good to be with you. There's so much going on in the country right now. I know we're going to talk about housing, but there's so much more that affects us on a daily basis. And I'm just proud of the delegation, our Massachusetts delegation, House and Senate, and the way they've hung together. And there have been times when this administration and the White House has targeted Massachusetts, targeted our universities and financial institutions, research centers, some of our elected officials, for doing the right thing, for being who we are, a welcoming, thoughtful, respectful, culturally open society. That has become a target. But I'm just very, very proud of the way our delegation, our elected leaders here in the state have stood up to that criticism, and how we've, the governor in particular has tried to use state resources, and our legislature use state resources to try to repair some of the damage that the administration, the White House, has done. So we're in a little battle here, on several levels. And so we're going to talk about some of that this morning. But I just wanted to, go on the record as saying I'm very, very proud to be from Massachusetts, and I'm grateful that one of my iron workers keeps calling me. Vinny, I should give you this call, Actually, sorry about that. You know what, I'm going to shut this off because that's going to keep happening. One of those things. But anyway, great to be with you, and excited to talk about housing because it's a real challenge. This past 6 months, we've been really redoubling our efforts in Washington, D.C. to try to come up with something that would at least increase supply. Right now, the country, we're short about 7 million housing units across the country. It's one of those, you look for areas of common ground with your Republican colleagues if you can find them. And, there are a lot of red states, rural areas that are seeing, look at Jim's experience yesterday in New Hampshire, $600,000 for the median price of a home. I mean, it used to be affordable in New Hampshire, and now it's getting, it's not as bad as here, but it's getting bad. And a lot of these rural states are struggling with that. So it gives us an opportunity, I think, to work with our Republican colleagues to try to come up with some solutions. And so it's nice to have an area amidst all this craziness where you can actually work with your colleagues and come up with some solutions. And that work is ongoing. And I think if the Democrats were fortunate enough to take back the House, I think you might see some real bold and impactful policies put into law that would allow us to do some of that work that we need to be done. So I'm gonna leave that for now, and John, do your thing.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
So we have a lot of, you look around the room, and it's represented by a lot of different types of organizations. On one hand, we have large institutions, life science firms or academic institutions who may be competing on a national level for elite talent. And those people, they may lose to other states. Whereas if we bring in the smaller organizations, small businesses and community organizations, we're seeing a strain on the workforce as people are forced to go farther and farther out to find an affordable zip code. So from your vantage point in the House Financial Services Committee, how urgent is this dual housing inventory crisis to the survival of New England employers?
Yeah, so they sometimes refer to it as the double housing, the dual housing crisis, where not only is it an impact on residents and young families trying to buy their first home or find an affordable rental apartment, but also it's the other impact, which is on our employers. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize Dave Hallway and Tommy Flynn from the National Association of Government Employees. So he's got a national perspective. And then Vinnie Coyle, my brother from Iron Workers Local 7, who, when things get slow here, we've got to send iron workers. That's what I did for a half dozen years. I worked out of town. I worked in New Orleans, worked in Chicago, worked in New York City, worked out in New Mexico. When there was no work here, our workers travel. They've got high skills and they're in high demand in other areas. So we do have that challenge of trying to locate our workers elsewhere around the country during a difficult time and trying to find housing for people. So it's terribly urgent right now. I think we're doing some things that are obstacles to the development of affordable housing. And look, when we talk about housing, it's all of the above, right? Like Joe Biden used to say, we need all of the above in terms of energy policy. Well, we need all of the above in housing policy. We need deeply affordable, low-income housing. Happy to say in my district we're doing a lot of that. We just finished the Lynch homes at Old Colony, 878 units of deeply affordable housing named after my mother. Marty Walsh did that when he was mayor. We just knocked the whole thing down and rebuilt it, and it's spectacular. It's spectacular. It's right across from Joe Moakley Park, right across from the beach, and it's really an impressive development now. And the crime rate, by the way, has plummeted because people feel like they're seen and they're respected, right? And a lot of the difficulty and tension in that development. And I used to represent the residents there. When I was a new attorney, I took on cases for asbestos on the pipes, lead paint on the windows, too many people in one apartment, just substandard housing. But since we've been able to fix it up, there's a nice vibe there. The crime rate has dropped. People feel like they're being respected, and they feel like they're part of the community. We redesigned it so that it's part of the wider South Boston community rather than walled off as a housing development for the poor or people who are struggling. So, and we're just beginning the redevelopment of the John W. McCormick, the Mary Ellen McCormick housing development right across the way. So when we're all in, by the end of those two projects, we'll have over $1 billion. $1 billion in federal money for those two developments. Of course, we're going to add workforce housing. That's the other tranche of housing that I want to talk about, which is a real gap in our policy. We oftentimes, we see people who are really, really, really struggling. We say, we got to help those people. Well, now you've got people who are nurses, doctors, teachers, firefighters who can't afford to live in the city. And there's got to be construction workers, we want to make sure that there's that middle tranche of housing as well, often called workforce housing. And then, of course, we have unaffordable housing, market rate housing. And oftentimes, that type of development allows us to to share the wealth a little bit and fund some of the low-income and moderate housing needs. So we need all of that, and that's the real challenge we have going forward right now. We've got an active, you talk about the level of urgency. We do have a housing bill, the 21st Century Housing Bill, that is, the Senate has passed one version. No surprise, the House has passed a different version. And we're trying to work out the differences there. I think Tim Scott, the Republican chair, had unrealistic expectations. He was insisting that we just take this Senate bill and pass it in the House. Meanwhile, you've got 60 members of the Financial Services Committee that I sit on who have been dying to work on housing issues and have all kinds of good ideas, bipartisan ideas. French Hill is the chair of Financial Services. I've had dinner at his house probably half a dozen times. Good guy, Arkansas, and we agree on a lot. And so those agreements have found their way into our legislation. We've got some good ideas, I'll give you one. So right now, any disabled veteran who tries to get into public housing, their disability benefits count against their income. So if I have a serious, and I've got them, I've got thousands of disabled veterans in my district. Because they're getting a disability benefit, because they're a World War II or a Korean War veteran or a Vietnam veteran, they're disqualified. They're disqualified because their income is too high. They don't qualify for public housing. Well, in this bill, on the House side, our bill basically discounts. So it is not a factor. So a lot of these disabled veterans would now, when this bill passes, they would be eligible for public housing, low-income housing, as they should be. The fact that they served our country and came home with the scars of war, either visible or invisible, a lot of these, and this is affecting a lot of our recent returnees from Iraq and Afghanistan. These kids that have done, 4, 5, 6, 7 tours of duty, that has a corrosive effect on your psyche oftentimes. And so, we've got a lot of returning vets. As you know, we've got a very, very high suicide rate right now with a lot of our returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so a lot of those folks could use some stabilized housing. And so it's just one example of some of the, and we agree with that. Democrats and Republicans, we co-sponsored that, and we supported it, and it passed. So now the normal process we would go to conference and kind of work out the difference between House and Senate bills. But the Senate right now, under Tim Scott, is refusing to go to conference. I've had conversations with Senator Warren. She's sort of leading the charge on our side in the Senate. We were in church the other day. We were at it was a ceremony, and they happened to sit us both together in church, and so, you take any opportunity you can. So I said, how about this housing bill, And, we chatted for a bit. So we'll keep working at it. We've got great partners in the House with Senator Warren and Senator Markey. There's no daylight between our positions in the House and Senate, at least in the Massachusetts delegation. So I'm very hopeful of making progress. But there are wide differences, unfortunately, in some respects, in terms of housing. So, but all of that, points out the urgency of getting something done sooner rather than later. There's also, last thing I'll say on this, there's also a certain train of thought in the Democratic circles there. And when we're pushing, for some solutions, people are saying to me, in some cases, well, look, why do you want to pass this version when the Republicans are in charge? Shouldn't we wait to get a housing bill passed? When we could do our own bill when we're in the majority. I understand that thinking, but again, the urgency is so great. There are some bipartisan agreements. Let's get something done right now. I know Lydia Downing's here and others who are champions on behalf of people who are struggling. we need to get some help for them now in the short term. And yeah, we'll do another bill. We'll do a 2.0. We'll do a housing 2.0 if and when the Democrats take control of the House. But we've got to we can't keep delaying this. It's been far too long since we've had a comprehensive housing bill in the United States. And, we've got that shortage of 7 million units. So we need to start building now, put people to work, and start putting some of these families into housing. Yeah.
And there's a lot in that bill. Do you see that there's any timeline or expectation for, any expectation for when you think this sort of becomes a reality for folks and impactful for folks here?
Well, the clock is running. We're getting closer and closer to the election.
Yeah.
So I know that Speaker Johnson is nervous about losing the House, so I think he's going to try to send members home as often as possible to allow them to work in their districts on their elections or re-elections. So time is short. We don't have much time here. The primary here is September 1st. So and generally July and August are pretty slow here. In Washington as well as here. People go away and they lose focus. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the shortage of time. Yeah.
So we covered a lot on the housing bill, and if we kind of shift now and look at beyond just the financial aspect of down payment assistance, if we look at the construction portion of this, right?
Yeah.
So even if you work on those aspects, the mechanics of the financing, we still have to put sticks in the ground. If we look at materials, supply chain delays, regulatory compliance, it makes it incredibly expensive to build affordable housing in New England.
Yeah.
You mentioned the supply and 7 million or so units that are needed. For the developers or builders in the room, how exactly will modernizing federal financing rules lower the per square foot costs of construction and accelerate our local housing pipeline?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of issues on cost. First and foremost, I know Vinnie Coyle's here from the ironworkers. Right now we have a 50% tariff on steel. So immediately, when the Trump administration came in, his tariff program increased the cost of Canadian steel, where a lot of our steel comes from in the Northeast. That went up 50 cents. And I don't know if Joe Burns here from the Carpenters, but they put a 25% tariff on lumber. So that immediately spiked. And other aggregate materials, there were tariffs put on those as well to affect concrete. So when you've got steel, lumber, concrete, those are three basic building blocks of a lot of our housing. And those went up precipitously to the point where even some projects that had just been bid by the contractor, once those prices went up, they had to pull back their bids and go back to the drawing board. So we have a lot of projects in my district and in eastern Massachusetts that have gone through the zoning process, they've gone through the community process, they've gone through the environmental process, and they're ready to go. But because of interest rates and the level of uncertainty and the exceedingly high costs, developers have refused to put a shovel in the ground and actually begin those projects. So that's been troublesome. Some of the other issues are energy costs. We have high energy costs, utility costs here, and we're in a competition, right? We're in a competition with Northern Virginia. I see an awful lot of construction going on there. Amazon just built their new headquarters down there. We're competing with Raleigh-Durham, the research triangle down there. They're trying to do what we do. They're trying to build their college and university and research centers. We've got Austin, Texas. I often find developers will come into my office and say, we've got this idea and we're looking at several locations. They'll always mention Austin, when they're really, sometimes we forget we're in a competition. And if we make it so prohibitive to build here, the competition is going to go elsewhere. And I'm afraid that the things that we take for granted here, which is a vibrant student population, feeding our research centers and hospitals and universities, we'll lose that competitive edge if we're not careful. So we've got to be very mindful of that. Zoning restrictions here, pretty strict. I know in the city of Boston, we've got some rather exclusive and expensive energy requirements when we're building new residential homes. I do like the idea. The governor has really been pushing transit-oriented housing. So, it requires, it doesn't require a car, right? If you're living near the rapid transit and the rapid transit works, you should be all set. So, and we've made a sizable investment in our rapid transit and in our rail system. We've got to do more on that. I think some of the tendencies to people to want to live closer into the downtown area of Boston is the fact that the commute can be a bear. And if we made rail access, for those outlying communities, I think would expand the supply of housing for people who want to work in Boston and yet live in the suburbs. But we've got to work on that much more vigorously than we have in the past. We did get, in the last big transportation bill, we did get $1 billion for the T. Happy about that. But there's so much more work to be done. And our infrastructure is older, right? So we've got, that's sort of a handicap for us in many, many ways. I just had a interesting discussion with Paul Gosar. He represents Arizona, complaining that I had amendment in to put $1 billion into the MBTA. He was asking why should one agency get $1 billion? And I explained to him, I said, when the trains were rolling off were first coming off the rails in Boston back in 1898, I said Arizona was still a territory. That's how old our stuff is. And I said, they're into their highways and they've got some water challenges out there. I said, we've got old infrastructure. So in any event, the amendment passed. So I was happy about that. But some of our colleagues don't see the challenges that we have. It's part of nature, I guess. You see what you
You
do.
talked about housing it's very much a local issue. You talked about zoning. There's land use policy issues. Massachusetts has you talked about transportation. We have the MBTA Communities Act, and some towns are pushing back, right, and not as accommodating to that work. Mm-hmm. And then there is other type of innovation around accessory dwelling units and ADUs that is having more traction in towns. I was actually at South Shore Chamber of Commerce had a luncheon, 3 mayors last week. So it had mayor from Weymouth, Braintree, and Quincy. And one of the things
3 great mayors too, by the way.
3 great mayors.
Mayor Koch, Mayor Joyce, and Mayor Mike Melise down in Weymouth.
Yeah. One of the things they talked a lot about housing.
Yeah.
And they talked about the challenges. They all recognize they need housing, but just, they're faced with challenges of putting in housing and doing developments because residents have a lot of pushback, even ones that may be living in a public housing space and saying, I don't want to, it's like, well, you're in one.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting. And, as you think about, your perspective and just, how do we help these folks that are sort of on the ground with adding more housing, whether it's some federal incentives, or how do we work with, across, from federal all the way down to that local level to make it easier for folks when they're running into that problem of the constituent raising their hand and pushing back.
Yeah. So I've had that in my district. So the town of Milton, I represent the town of Milton. Beautiful community. I think it's like USA Today, best community in America or something like that. So they were resistant to some of the ideas there around transit-oriented housing, and they felt it was not in character with their community, and you know, they had a point. They had a point. However, you know what? I'm in the national legislature, so you see how all 50 states are doing things. Interestingly enough, in Washington State, they ran into that same challenge, and there were a lot of communities that embraced it. There were others that did not think it was such a great idea. So what they did was they redid their legislation. Basically, what is it, 40B? They redid their version of it, and they said, okay, we're going to put an obligation on every city and town to build a certain amount of affordable housing. They said, however, if there's resistance in a town, we're going to give you a county option. So if there's resistance in the town, then it has to be built in the county. There's an option. So what they were doing out there is the towns that didn't want, so there was money that was provided, an incentive for towns and cities to do this, right, from the state. They wanted people to develop housing. They said, if you resist it, that money's going away, and within your county, it's going to go to another town that is willing to do the affordable housing. So they still got their 40B number, the number of units, but it was spread around the county. So the towns that said no lost the money, so they were penalized, and the towns that said yes in the county were rewarded. And so at the end of the day, they got more affordable housing developed in a faster timeline than these other states that are forcing the towns to do it, each and every town, and fighting that fight with lawsuits and ballot questions and things like that. So I thought it was a way to get around the resistance and create the housing, to be honest with you. And in some of those cases, it was less than a mile away in another town that they developed the affordable housing. So it wasn't like people were excluded or they were put out in a remote area. And I thought it bypassed that friction that we're seeing here. The other piece that I do want to say, like for our area, for 4 days a week I live down in Washington, D.C. They have all these farms, like nobody's business. Natasha knows, she lived down there. They can take a farm, with 1,000 acres and pop up 2,300 housing units like nobody's business, and they do. They've got a terrible traffic problem there with them coming in from if you're outside the Beltway, you're in trouble. I mean, I have a little condo about the size of my parking spot that's right on Capitol Hill, and I walk to work. But if you live outside the Beltway, it's hellacious getting into the city. It really is. But they've got these big plots of land that we don't have. But I would say that a lot of our federal properties, and I'm talking about our federal housing developments, back in the day they had a ton of land, and they spread like the Lynch homes at Old Colony. There were 3-story buildings, and they were kind of spaced far apart. Rather than the 878 units that were originally built on that, when we redesigned it, we can actually put 3,000 units or 4,000 units on that same property if we design it properly. The same thing with Mary Ellen McCormick. It's right now it's about 1,000 units, but by the time we redevelop it, there's going to be about 4,000 units there. The VA, our VA campuses, the VA campus down in Brockton, 31 acres. And we use about 5 of those. The rest of it, so we're going to build on some of these locations. The VA in Jamaica Plain, 16 acres, and we use about 3 acres. So we have these big lots of land that federally controlled, and if we use our West Roxbury, same thing, big VA site there. There's ways to build housing by using that. That's what we did in Old Colony. That's what we're doing at Mary Ellen McCormick, where land costs are a big factor. And here we are with the federal government, and they have all these parcels and that's just those few. There's hundreds of them. We have a database at the federal level on federal property. We don't have that at the state and municipal level. So in that housing bill that we're trying to do now, we're requiring all state, city, county, municipal, and federal agencies to list the properties that they have, so that developers know that these parcels are controlled by the government and are available in many cases for housing development. So we're putting that together as well. So those are some of the challenges that we have here that I think are solvable, but we've got to think out of the box, I think. Yeah.
That's great. So I think we're maybe one more question. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of topics, and there's so many different angles that people in the room are attacking this problem, right? From developers, from legislation, financing. When you think of, from your vantage point, what are the top 2 or 3 things that collectively we as a group can do or should be doing to really move the needle on this problem?
Vote Democratic. I would say that. Even absolutely. Even when things were, normal back in the day, we had my Republican colleagues would like to zero out or level fund the housing budget, and that's not good. That's not good. That doesn't serve anyone, and let's just say their priorities were misplaced, and so I think there's a real obligation here to get back at it. After the Second World War, we had 17 million Americans coming back from service in that war, from 1941 to 1945. We had 17 million veterans coming back, and none of them could afford a home. Very few of them had a lot of these were high school graduates. They went right from high school into the military, men and women. And so the country had some big challenges. People couldn't afford a home back then. And there were 2 big changes that the government made that I think we should be very, very proud of. One, they passed the GI Bill. They let a lot of those men and women attend college, and and that just expanded our potential enormously for the next generation. And then they came up with something very simple but very powerful. They came up with the 30-year fixed mortgage. 30-year fixed mortgage, which allowed people to amortize the cost of buying a home. We need and that allowed everyone to surge into the housing market. It created our suburbs, right? All of a sudden, people started buying land and building houses. Companies, it was a free-for-all. And that led to our highway system where people were living in the suburbs, and so it just changed the way of life here in the United States, from coast to coast. We need something like that now. We have a new challenge. We have a whole generation of Americans, again, who can't, they're living with their moms. They can't get their first home. There's no starter homes. My first home I bought, the kids in the neighborhood call it the Haunty, short for haunted house. I paid $14,000 for that house. I can't get a parking spot for $14,000. That was 1983. And I went in with my cousin Bubba, a couple of my nephews, and we went in and ripped that out and fixed it up. I still own it. I don't even want to tell you what it's worth now. It's just ridiculous. But yeah, so those starter homes are not there right now. We have to figure out a way to create that. I'm worried that we're not coming up with that solution on behalf. And I've sat with some of our mortgage originators and said, is there some way that we can de-risk, underwriting mortgages in a way, de-risk the cost to the bank so that we can lower the rates a couple of points, so you can put somebody in, you can get a mortgage and someone can actually buy a first home. There's got to be a way. We got to figure that out. And I think that's the way to do it, is de-risk the bank's position and allow them to come down on their interest rate, and then use the market forces to put those people in homes. So I think that's one of the key ways that we solve this. Yeah.
Well, I think we have a couple of minutes just for a quick question or two
Sure.
of the congressman. Which is going to remind everyone that 20 years ago, the average age of first-time home buyer was 25. Today, it's 40.
Wow.
Times
Yep.
have changed. So with that, do you have a question for the congressman? Just identify yourself, ladies.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Tara.
Hi, Tara.
Originally from Quincy, but
Very good.
I work with Commonwealth Land Trust. We have 450 beds in the Commonwealth for individuals that are otherwise unhoused.
Oh, God bless you. Thank you.
Pull people out of homelessness and give them wraparound clinical services in the housing that we provide. You told us about sitting next to Elizabeth Warren in church and having this conversation. Can you help identify what the key challenges are between the congressional bill and the Senate bill that are the stopgaps or the blockages from moving forward?
Sure. So I think, first of all, there's the desire of House members to be relevant, right? So here they are, they're on the Housing Committee. They've been trying to work housing. The request from the Senate is, just pass what we did. Never mind your ideas. Never mind your districts. Just pass what we send you. That's the position of the Senate.
For every issue?
That's it. No, the housing bill. They said, here's the housing bill. Pass this. Pass this. How stupid is that? How stupid is that? I would never dream of doing something like that to the Senate, say, oh, here's my bill. And by the way, just pass it. Don't debate it. No amendments. Just sign it and send it back. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. We got 435 politicians in the House. You think that's going to work? So that's problem one. And that's a big one. It's just respect. It's just, you're working on this issue. You care about this issue. You got homeless people in your district. You grew up in public housing. You know what that means. And you work on that issue, and it's in your blood, and you know your residents. Like me, last week, I jog along Carson Beach, but then I cut back through Lynch Homes at Old Colony, because there's a nice little path there you can run through. And I see my neighbors, and it's good. It's good to, visibility is good. So this veteran, I think he was probably Vietnam-era veteran, he's out on his little veranda there, and he says, Lynch, come here. So he waves me over. He goes, you got to see my apartment. So it was a little thing about the height of that chair right there. He pulls me up, shows me his apartment, and then he's so proud of where he's living now. He was homeless. A U.S. Army veteran who was homeless, and now he's in Lynch Homes at Old Colony, and he's living the dream. So stuff like that. You want to be part of that. You don't want to just sign off on what somebody else has done. You got all these ideas. You worked out differences with your Republican colleagues, and you've got some good ideas that are bipartisan. And Maxine Waters, dear God, is there anybody else in this country that is more dynamic and pro-housing? I visited her district. She's got some major issues out there in her district with people living on the streets, but they don't want to allow, the House members to have input on that bill. And all we asked was, let's go to conference. Let's work this out. You put your bill in, we'll just debate it back and forth. We'll do this and we'll get something done. So that's the problem. That's the problem. That there's, and I think it's being driven by Tim Scott. Maybe it's by the White House. I don't know. But they've put severe limits on what can be considered on that bill. And so I think it's disrespectful to members of the House. I think I think we're selling ourselves short in terms of what the potential could be there. I think there's a lot of things in our bill that they would agree to. I think there's a lot of things in their bill that we would agree to. But people just want to have, it's why you run for Congress, right? You don't run to sign off on somebody else's bill. You run to have to make a difference, because I think growing up in public housing, like I did for 15 years, with my 5 sisters, my family, what we went through, I think that gives me a perspective on people living in public housing that no one else, especially in the Senate, has. And I think I can contribute to that debate. And I think I'm closer to the people, in public housing than a lot of those members. And I appreciate it more. So, I think because my people elected me, I have a right to be there. I have a right to be in that debate. And I am not going to take a back step, to someone who really, doesn't have a greater claim to that issue than I do. So that's as simple as that. Yeah. But
I think we have time for one quick question, and then we might have 2 minutes for a photo with Congressman, if you'd like.
okay. Hi there.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Deb O'Brien from Community Resources for Justice. We do work with developmentally disabled adults.
God bless you. Thank you.
As well as helping people reentry from both state prison here in Massachusetts and federal prison. So housing is something that's really near and dear to us. Being a not-for-profit, it's hard for our staff to also afford housing. I know in the ballot this year in Massachusetts, there's a question about rent control.
Yeah.
Which of course sounds great to everybody up front, but from what you were saying earlier, that will decrease housing stock and decrease interest. So how do I don't know, educate my staff? How do we educate the public that that's only going to make things worse in Massachusetts?
Yeah. Well, I was here last time. My older sister, Linda, worked for rent control back in the day during the Kevin White administration. So, people just disinvested. They stopped investing in housing when we put in rent control last time. It was a disaster. It was a disaster. I mean, ironically, that's why we had fixer-uppers, because people just walked away from their property. And they had this whole, if you remember, they had a whole waiver program where you could get an exclusion. Like if the house was run down, if the landlord just let the house just, go into complete disrepair, then he or she could petition City Hall for a waiver, and they would say, oh dear God, yeah. So that's no longer a rent-controlled building. You can go back to market rents because the house was in disrepair. So that pattern is not good. We have to create more housing. That's the problem we have right now, supply and demand. And if you put in rent control, they'll go to Raleigh, Durham, they'll go to Austin, they'll go to other locations, they'll go to Northern Virginia, and we'll lose all that investment. It'll backfire on us. I don't think people realize what'll happen. So, in fairness, I'm in D.C., so I'm not in the debate on rent control here. So I need to educate myself. But if it's the same model that they did last time, and rent control is rent control. So, I'd have to look at it more closely to see if there's any wrinkles here that might change it a little bit. But if it's the rent control that we had last time, it didn't work. It actually backfired and made things worse. So I'm worried about that. I think there are other incentives that we can use to create more housing, and we've got some good housing developers out there. I remember during COVID, a lot of our developers came in and said, you know what, I'm gonna freeze rents. You know, I'm not going to evict anybody. You know, wind companies, one of the biggest landlords in the state, they passed a policy and said, we evict no one, we lay off no one of our staff, and we will figure this out on the other side. You know, so you know there are some good people that understand the value of housing to families, and so you know I think there are better ways to solve this. They're more complicated, and they take hard. I know they don't have the simple, you know, rent control sounds so simple. You know, let's just control it. But I think it has dire consequences that people aren't really thinking through. Yeah.
Well, with that, I just want to thank John Barron for moderating.
Yeah. Thank you,
Great
John.
job.
Thank you, my friend. Yeah, thank you.